Good day and welcome to yet another one of our Rand Swiss weekly wraps. As usual, what we'll do is we'll cover stuff that happened in the last week and talk about how it might affect you and your money going forward. This week our three topics are going to be, firstly, the South African CPI number, then we're going to talk about Iran and Russia, and finally we're going to talk about China. That'll be a deep dive for the week. There's lots of stuff happening in China that's worth looking at. So let's start with the local CPI number. Came in slightly lower than last time, but still well above the target range of 3 to 6%. It's over 7% it came in at. One of the benefits, or one of the lucky factors we saw in there was the fact that obviously fuel prices have been coming down slightly in South Africa, and that's helped the inflation number. That being said, from what I can see, that's probably going to turn around reasonably soon. We've seen fuel price, or oil prices at least, stop falling and recover a bit from their lows. At the same time, the rand has gotten established a range, I think, above 18 rands for the dollar. As I speak to you right now, it's about 18.30 something for the US dollar, which is obviously quite a bit weaker than it was a few months ago. So one would anticipate that some of the good news around inflation may be disappearing. Now, as I talked to you guys, when this first started happening, at the start of the year or so, and talking about the fact that inflation is really taking off and that's going to cause trouble, and it has caused trouble. One of the things I had talked about back then, if you go back and check my forecast for the last thing was last year or so, was about the fact that what's happening with inflation is going to cause strike action. It's going to cause unrest among workers. Why? Because workers are absorbing really high inflation. They are finding that the food is costing more, that the petrol is costing more, that everything that they're buying is costing more. Recently we just had a report from CMH that's expecting car prices to go up 10% in the next 3-4 months. Tire prices are ballistic at the moment because of what's happening with regards to Transnet. The Transnet strike, by the way, also caused by higher inflation. The offer by to Transnet was basically in line with max inflation in band, but the workers wanted more than that because they are seeing that the inflation rate that they are seeing in their real lives is more than the inflation rate that SARB says was going to be the high end of that band. So that's another discrepancy we are seeing here. I think that's going to be a problem going forward. Unless inflation comes down, expect to see workers demanding these 7-8% inflation related increases, or possibly even more, because sometimes they're experiencing wage increases that are, even if they're 7-8%, that doesn't quite match the actual inflation expectations and the inflation experiences. where they may be seeing personal inflation numbers in the double digits. So you could be expecting some pretty serious labor unrest unless inflation comes down, or unless basically we see companies buckle to worker pressure. But that's going to cause more inflation in the future, because that's how inflation becomes established. Temporary inflation is stuff like shocks in supplies, shocks in commodity prices, and so on. Embedded inflation, inflation that causes people to really expect inflation to increase every year at the same kind of rate, or a really high rate, that has to do with wages. When wages increase, they don't come back down. When we see, for instance, oil prices increase, they can come back down, 120.90, not a problem. You get your wages up from basically 100,000 a year to 150,000 rand a year. You're not going to accept a wage drop from 150,000 to 120,000 just because inflation has come down. That does not happen. So once wages become higher, that pretty much locks in that level of inflation. Okay, so that's the CPI number. The next thing we're going to talk about is what's happening with regards to Iran and the relationship with Russia. So for those that have been watching the news, Iran is going through one of its periodic protests periods where we are seeing quite a number of people on the streets, some really brutal reprisals by the government. We've seen this a number of times. This is not the first time, but this time may be different. Firstly, what we are seeing is it happening in more than the normal number of cities. Usually it happens in 1 or 2 cities. Now it's throughout the country. The next thing is that you are seeing more professionals on the street, more, you're seeing grannies, on the street. Why? Because this particular event was inspired because a young lady was not wearing her hijab, that covering on her head properly, according to the government, and was showing some hair, was arrested, and somehow in that arrest or her detainment, she was injured and died. Very young lady, 20 years old or so. And that obviously kind of inspires people. When you have this symbol of injustice, that's obviously injustice, and inspires people. And so now we are seeing pretty widespread rise throughout the whole of Iran. People being, young girls, like really young girls, like 10 years old, 12 years old, chanting in the streets about the injustice. We're seeing women walking around protesting by not wearing the hijab. We are seeing, clashes where riot police are basically being thrown back by crowds. We recently saw a fire at a major prison that killed apparently quite a number of prisoners, and those prisoners tended to be at that particular prison a lot of political prisoners. So a lot of stuff is happening in Iran, and at the same time, Iran's relationship with Russia has apparently gotten a lot stronger because they are supplying the Russians, and this is like what is kind of widely known but not kind of widely admitted by the parties involved, with these drones, these really, really effective drones. So what's happened is Russia is getting these cheap drones, but $20,000 drones, which, if you know anything about military expenditure, is quite cheap for a military piece of equipment that's effective. I mean, sometimes when the US fired, for instance, missiles into Iran or back in the Gulf War, those things were costing millions of dollars each missile that they were firing to destroy something. Often the missile cost more than the thing that they were destroying. Now, what the Russians are doing, they basically have acquired these really cheap drones, these tens of thousands, $20,000 drones. And what that means is that they can really, afford to send these things in. They are kamikaze drones, they're one-way trip drones. And even if they basically get shot down by, for instance, Ukrainian missiles and artillery and whatnot, the actual weapons that they use, the Ukrainian basically military weapons that are used to shoot down the drones, will often cost more than the drones that they are destroyed. And if the drones do get through, basically they're effectively terror weapons. They're not that well guided often. So sometimes you see them blowing up in the wrong place, maybe the right place, because who knows what the Russians' real motive is. Maybe it's just causing terror. So you're seeing these things blow up in places where there's no actual infrastructure that you should think is important enough to blow up, but they are attacking Kiev. And Kiev, remember, has been out of this thing for the war for quite some time. There was a period where the Russians really rushed forward, but then they are pushed back, and now they're nowhere near. The front line is nowhere near Kiev, which is the main city of or Kyiv, or however you pronounce it, the main city of the Ukraine. But now the Russian drones are getting there, and they actually are causing these troubles, and they've been doing it for a number of days so far. And like I said, the belief is that these drones are coming from Iran. There's apparently some evidence that the Iranians are supplying the drones. And what this means is that there is becoming a bit of a split in the world, where the enemies of, for instance, the US, be it the Iranians, be it the Russians, be it the North Koreans, possibly the Chinese, are kind of forming their own alliance, an alliance of convenience, an alliance of of necessity, but alliance nonetheless that might be a problem going forward. Okay, so Iranians problems with protests. Iranians also dealt with Russia. Who knows what might be the long-term impact of that? I think the one most dangerous aspect to that could be the possibility of the transfer of nuclear technology from the Russians to the Iranians. Remember, the Iranians have always wanted nukes. The Iranians have basically been prevented from getting nuclear material for quite some time. They do have their own nuclear power plants, but it's heavily monitored. But if they have a Russian help, it's possible that they could actually escape those things. The Russians have more nukes than anybody else in the world, and it's quite easy for them to basically supply the Iranians if they tend to be the only friend that they have left in the world at the moment. Okay, that is the Iran-Russia situation. And now our deep dive into China. What's happening in China at the moment? A couple of major things. Firstly, we have the CCP meeting where Xi Jinping is basically being re-elected as the head of China for the third time in a row. This is important because the Chinese used to have a 2-term limit. You basically, what happens, you get your first term, then you basically get reappointed. At the point you get reappointed, like halfway through the first 5 years, you have a conference. At that conference, you get reappointed for the next 5 years, but you also appoint the guy that's going to replace you after those 5 years. So everybody kind of overlaps. So you overlapped with the last guy for your first 5, and you overlap with the next guy for your last 5. So there's this overlap, there's this kind of transition of power. Now, this wasn't always the case. We had Mao, for instance, he had power for a long, long time, effectively leader for life. But when Deng Xiaoping basically took over, he really reformed things. He basically is the one that resulted in the creation of the China we know today, which is a huge global power, the second largest economy in the world. Mao presided over a China that basically had the largest famine in history, tens of millions of people dying. So Deng Xiaoping really had a great influence on China. And what has come out is apparently that the successors to him were appointed kind of by him. So the next couple of successors, the next basically 20 years after him, was kind of like his people that he kind of vetted. Xi Jinping is not one of those people. He's past that point. So he's the first kind of guy that's come in that hasn't had this basically kind of vetting process early on, and he's decided to basically become a Mao, like we saw in the past, like with how Mao was in the 50s and the 60s. So basically he said, I'm kind of leader for life. What I say goes in terms of what the law is. There's no kind of higher power than me. And in the last kind of meeting where you're supposed to reappoint somebody, appoint his successor, he said, no, I'm not going to appoint his successor, kind of indicating that he was going to get a third term. Okay, that's what's happened right now. Now, while this is happening, something else has happened. The Chinese have not released economic data that was scheduled to be released this week. Why? There's lots of rumors around it, but basically I think the consensus is that's because those numbers are very bad. The Chinese growth for this year is well below what they wanted. They wanted like 5-7%. They're going to get maybe not even 3%. Okay, maybe lower than that because of all the lockdowns happening right now. The Chinese are still pursuing this one, this zero tolerance policy that was reinforced again in this CCP meeting. And the zero tolerance policy says if there's a couple cases, we are going to shut down whole cities, whole regions, or maybe 100 million people at a time to make sure the thing doesn't spread. It's been very successful until the most recent variants of COVID. The more recent variants are much more contagious and also much less lethal, so they're not really a huge problem. In other parts of the world, you get COVID right now, it's like the flu, not really a big deal. China has not had this. They've still following this whole policy. So, really bad economic numbers while we have this CCP meeting. And at the same time, in the CCP meeting, there was a reinforcement of their desire to get back Taiwan. And Taiwan is a really, really important factor going forward. If you think Russia and the Ukraine cause problems, there's nothing close to what China and Taiwan would cause if the war really occurred there. China, far bigger part of the world economy than Russia is. Taiwan, far more essential to the global economy than Ukraine is. Also, a war between those two parties will involve places like South Korea, will involve places like Malaysia, Indonesia, will basically involve places like Japan, maybe even Australia. It has a really, really large impact across a lot of the world, okay? And what we are seeing right now is that the Chinese Communist Party still seems to be pretty clear that they want to take Taiwan. The only hope we have is that they decide to take it slowly over a period of many decades as opposed to trying to do what the Russians have done at the moment. And finally, when it comes to China, one thing I want to point out is that the Biden administration just made a move in the last couple of weeks that's been incredibly effective. What they've done is they basically banned the sale of very high-end computer chips to China, and they've also banned the sale of equipment used to make lower-end chips in China. China accounts for a large number of chips, but not really high-end chips and not really high-value chips. Like half of all the revenue in the world made around selling computer chips goes to US-based companies. China makes a lot of number of chips, a big chunk of the world's number of chips, but those are generally going to be very low-quality chips. And they also don't make it themselves. They make it using equipment that they get from places like the Netherlands, which is one of the places that makes these huge fabrication machines that actually operate and create these chips. And these fabrication machines are gigantic, especially for the high-end machines. The high-end machines can often cost $15-17 billion each, one like fab. So that's a huge outlay. So the Chinese, if they are cut out from firstly importing these chips, and secondly from importing the machinery that can actually help them make the chips, to a large extent, this semiconductor industry is going to be virtually destroyed. At the same time, the expertise, the workers they have working in China, especially those from the US, have found themselves basically faced with a choice. Either you lose your US citizenship or you resign from your job in China and move back home. That's the choices. And right now, we are finding lots of people that are based in these Chinese companies that are American are facing this kind of dilemma. So I think when we talked about the fact the world is splitting apart, but there's a bifurcation of the world, where the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians are getting together as their own little group here, they're doing it because they have to. Okay, the Chinese need to have a source of raw materials that's not going to cross the ocean and be vulnerable to attack from the US. That's Russia right next to them. The Russians need access to manufactured materials. That's the Chinese right next to them. They may need access to, China's may need access to oil. The Iranians are providing that. So there's this little congregation of parties getting together that's going to form, I think, a bloc against the Americans. I personally still believe that the Americans are going to be by far the more powerful party because they have Europe and America and Russia, and Japan and Australia, and there's a global system that's much more on the side of the Americans than it is on the Chinese and the Russians, much more aligned ideologically. I mean, the Americans are more aligned with the Europeans and the Japanese, than the Chinese are aligned with the Iranians, for instance, because of the what's happening with the Uyghurs and whatnot. So that is what China looks like at the moment. Weak economy, really dire political situation, the possibility of war with Taiwan, and becoming part of a new alliance with Russia, Iran, already North Korea is in there, possibly things like Venezuela, basically the or the anti-US bloc in the world. And I think that's going to be where we end it for this week on that dire news. Thanks for coming through, and I'll look forward to speaking to you guys again next week.